For 14 years, the rusted barrel held the last breath of a man who never came home. Concrete hardened over his bones, over his tools, over the dreams he carried in an aluminum lunchbox. When they finally cut that iron drum open, they found more than a skeleton. They discovered the silence of an entire family petrified in time. The morning of April 3, 1992 began like any other in the small house in Rio de Janeiro's North Zone. João Batista de Souza woke before sunrise as he had for 20 years, ever since he'd left the countryside of Minas Gerais, in search of a better life. At 52, his calloused hands knew every type of brick, every texture of cement, every weight of a sledgehammer. To everyone in the region, he was Seu João do Tijolo, John of the Brick, a nickname he carried with pride even if the smile on his face had grown rarer over the years. His wife was still asleep when he rose from the double bed that shared the room with a scratched formica wardrobe. His 3 children also rested in the room next door, in bunk beds he had built himself from leftover wood from an old job. The house had 2 small rooms, a tiny bathroom, and a kitchen where 2 people could barely fit. But it was the home he had managed to build with the sweat of hard labor, brick by brick, paycheck by paycheck. João pulled on his worn-out jeans, already permanently stained with cement at the knees, and slipped on the brown leather boots that had been with him for 5 years. The white tank top, somewhat grimy from time and work, hung loose on his lean but strong frame. Lastly, he put on the faded blue cap, a piece that never left his head, protection against the scorching sun of Rio's construction sites. In the small kitchen, he prepared the strong black coffee he drank every morning. As the water boiled on the 2-burner stove, he packed his aluminum lunchbox, 2 French rolls with mortadella, a banana, and a thermos of coffee. It was always the same, every single day. The routine soothed him, bringing order to a world that often seemed too chaotic for a simple man from the countryside. His wooden-handled sledgehammer leaned against the kitchen wall, along with other smaller tools he carried to work. The handle was worn smooth, polished by the friction of the calloused hands that gripped it daily. It was a heavy tool, but João wielded it with the dexterity of someone who had spent decades breaking down walls, adjusting structures, and shaping stubborn concrete. It was 5:30 in the morning when he left the house. The street was still empty, save for a few stray dogs scavenging through trash bags left by the neighbors. The air was humid, heavy with the characteristic scent of the North Zone, a mix of diesel from the buses, fried food from the corner bars, and the sweet smell of sugar cane from a home where someone was already making breakfast with hot syrup. The walk to the bus stop took 10 minutes. João knew every crack in the sidewalk, every pothole in the cobblestone street the neighborhood insisted on keeping. He exchanged silent nods with the neighbors who also left early for work. Dona Maria, who sold coffee on the corner, Seu Antonio, who drove a delivery truck, the new young woman who worked as a cleaner in Copacabana. The bus arrived punctually at 6 o'clock. João showed his work card to the conductor. He was entitled to a transport voucher, a benefit he considered a victory after so many years of working for himself. He always sat in the same seat, in the 3rd row on the right, and gazed out the fogged window as the vehicle snaked through the streets toward the construction site where he had been working for 3 months. It was an ambitious project, the construction of an industrial warehouse to be used as a distribution center. The contracting company was large, with modern machinery and a tight schedule. João worked on the team responsible for the reinforced concrete structure, a job that demanded strength, precision, and experience. His hands knew exactly how much force to apply, how to position the rebar, and when the concrete was at the right point to be molded. When the bus stopped at the corner near the site, João got off and walked the final 200 meters. The sun was beginning to appear on the horizon, painting the sky a pale orange that would soon be swallowed by the heat of the day. At the makeshift gate, he greeted the night watchman and picked up the yellow hard hat he wore during his shift. At 6:30 in the morning, João Batista de Souza walked onto the construction site for the last time. Several coworkers saw him arrive, greeting him with the usual gestures of men who shared the hardship of that life. No one could have imagined that in just a few hours, João's name would become the center of a mystery that would last for 14 years, buried along with him in the cold concrete of a forgotten mixer. The construction site was buzzing with activity when João arrived that April morning. The warehouse project was in its most intense phase, with dozens of workers operating simultaneously on different fronts. Cranes moved precast concrete beams, welders created orange sparks on the metal structures, and the deafening noise of machinery echoed across the grounds. João went straight to the area with the industrial concrete mixers. They were large machines with metal drums capable of mixing enormous quantities of concrete. His job in that section was physical and required technical knowledge, controlling the mix, adjusting the proportions of cement, sand, and gravel, and ensuring the slurry reached the ideal consistency to be poured into the forms. The main mixer was a robust piece of equipment, over 2 meters high, with iron wheels that allowed it to be moved around the site as needed. Its drums spun constantly during the mixing process, producing a metallic rumble that had become familiar to all the workers. João knew that machine like few others. He could tell by its sounds if the concrete was just right or if it needed more water or cement. For the first few hours of the morning, he worked as usual. Colleagues who were nearby later reported seeing João handling the mixer's controls, checking the quality of the concrete coming out of the drum, and instructing helpers on where to pour each load. He used his sledgehammer when necessary to break up a clump of cement stuck to the edges of the equipment, or to adjust parts that had shifted out of place. Around 9 o'clock, the pace on the site intensified. Trucks arrived constantly to deliver materials, and the pressure to meet the schedule made all the supervisors nervous. The company had promised to deliver the warehouse in record time, and any delay meant heavy fines in the contract. It was in this rush of activity that João Batista simply vanished from his colleagues' sight. Some later said they saw him near the main mixer around 9:30. Others claimed he was carrying bags of cement to supply the smaller machines. But no one could pinpoint the exact last time they had seen him working. Lunch was served at 11:30 in a covered area the company had set up for the workers. Hot meals were distributed for free, a benefit João always praised when talking to his family. But on that day, when the bell rang announcing the meal break, João did not appear. Initially, no one thought it was strange. It was common for some workers to be late when they were finishing an urgent task. The site foreman even asked about João, but other workers said he was probably dealing with a concrete issue at one of the more distant mixers. And if you are finding this true and disturbing story compelling, don't forget to subscribe to the channel to follow other untold Brazilian investigative cases. Activate the notification bell so you don't miss a single episode. When lunch ended and everyone returned to work, João's absence began to draw attention. His post at the main mixer was empty and the machine had stopped running. Other workers had to take over his duties to keep production from falling behind. But everyone found his sudden disappearance odd. The site foreman, a man named Sebastián, who had known João for years from other sites, began to search for him throughout the different areas of the grounds. He asked the crane operators if anyone had seen the mason, checked the portable toilets, and looked in the rest area where some workers napped during their break. Nothing. That's when someone suggested checking if João had felt unwell and gone home without telling anyone. It was a strange hypothesis, as he never did that. but the rush of the work sometimes prevented people from communicating properly. The foreman went to the gatehouse to speak with the guard. The conversation at the gatehouse brought the first strange piece of information of the day. The guard, who controlled the entry and exit of all employees, guaranteed that João had not passed through there since he had arrived in the morning. There was no record of him leaving, he had not been seen leaving, and he had not asked for the gate to be opened. And the site was completely enclosed by high walls. There was no other way out. From that moment on, a sense of worry took over the site. João Batista de Souza had simply disappeared inside a closed space under the eyes of dozens of coworkers without leaving any clue as to where he might be. His tools were scattered around the area where he worked. His aluminum lunchbox was still in the spot where he had left it that morning. But João had vanished like smoke. At 5 in the afternoon, when the shift ended and all the workers prepared to go home, the reality set in. João Batista was no longer on the site, and no one could explain how it had happened. Back at João Batista's home, a total silence fell when 6 o'clock in the evening arrived and he didn't appear. His wife, accustomed to her husband's military punctuality, began to feel an unease that grew in her chest like a stone. João never ran late. In 20 years of marriage, she could count on one hand the times he had come home outside of his usual hour. His 3 children also found it strange. The youngest, who was 12, had a habit of running to the front window every afternoon to watch his father get off the bus at the corner. It was a sacred ritual. João always waved when he saw the boy peeking through the thin fabric curtain. But on that day, several buses passed and stopped, and João did not get off any of them. At 7 in the evening, his wife made a decision she had never had to make before. She left the house to look for information. She left the children with a neighbor and took the same bus João took every morning. She didn't know the exact location of the site, but she knew it was near a soda factory, which was a landmark in the area. When she arrived at the construction site, it was already night. The grounds were closed with only a single yellowish light on at the gatehouse where the night watchman stood guard. He was a different man from the one who worked during the day. Younger, with the look of someone not used to answering questions from distressed families. The conversation was brief and confusing. The watchman said he didn't know João Batista, wasn't aware of any problems during the day, and suggested she come back the next morning to speak with the office staff. But something in the man's evasive manner made his wife suspicious. It was as if he knew more than he was letting on. The journey home was agonizing. On the bus, swaying through the poorly lit streets of the North Zone, she began to imagine all the possibilities. A work accident, a fight with a colleague, a health problem, a kidnapping, a robbery. Each hypothesis seemed more terrifying than the last. The next morning, very early, she returned to the construction site. This time she brought her eldest son, a 19-year-old who had started working as an electrician's assistant. Together they went to the gatehouse and asked to speak with someone in charge. What happened next would become the first great mystery of the João Batista case. The site foreman, the same Sebastián who had searched for João the previous afternoon, received the mother and son with a completely different version of the facts. According to him, João had not shown up for work on April 3rd. He had simply not appeared without giving notice, without calling, without justifying his absence. The information was absurd. His wife knew João better than anyone. He had left home normally at the usual time, with his work clothes, his tools, and his lunchbox. She had seen her husband get on the bus at the corner, just as he did every day. But the foreman was adamant. João had not been on the site that day. The situation grew even stranger when the mother and son managed to speak separately with some of the workers from near the concrete mixers. Several of them confirmed seeing João working normally that morning. A welder said he had greeted João around 8 o'clock. A mason's helper stated that João had instructed him on how to mix concrete around 9. It was an impossible contradiction to resolve. The workers said one thing, the supervisor said another. And in the middle of this confusing mess of stories, João Batista remained missing, as if he had never existed. The family decided to go to the police. At the nearest station, they were met by an investigator who seemed more interested in finishing his shift than in solving the case. He asked a few basic questions, jotted down the information in a greasy notebook, and told them they should wait. Disappearances of adults were common, he explained with a bored voice. Most of the time, people came back on their own after a few days. But the days passed, and João did not return. The first week was one of total desperation. His wife could not eat. His sons missed school. Neighbors came to offer help, but they didn't know what to do. It was as if a chasm had opened in the earth and swallowed João Batista, taking all the answers with him. The second week brought a new attempt at an investigation, this time by the family themselves. The eldest son managed to get a few days off from work and went to speak personally with every construction worker he could find. Most of them lived in the North Zone, in simple houses scattered throughout the neighborhood. The conversations were both revealing and deeply unsettling. Almost every worker who had been on site on April 3rd confirmed seeing João working as usual. Some remembered specific details, the blue cap he wore, the sledgehammer with its worn handle, the careful way he would check the quality of the concrete before releasing each load. But they all also spoke of the tense atmosphere that had descended upon the site after João vanished. The supervisors had instructed everyone not to discuss the matter with outsiders, especially not with journalists or the police. There were closed-door meetings, whispered conversations, and orders for everyone to focus on their work and forget what had happened. One of the workers, braver than the rest, revealed a piece of information that would plunge João's family into even deeper anguish. On the afternoon of April 3rd, after his disappearance had been discovered, there was strange activity near the concrete mixers. Machines were switched on outside of normal hours. Equipment was moved, and a specific area of the site was cordoned off without explanation. It was as if someone were cleaning up evidence of something that should not have happened or hiding something that was never meant to be found. The third week after João's disappearance brought the family their first great frustration. The police concluded their preliminary investigation without finding a single concrete clue as to what had occurred. The official report was laconic: a voluntary disappearance of an adult. Case closed due to a lack of evidence of a crime. It was a decision that completely ignored the contradictions between the workers' testimonies and the company's official version of events. The lead investigator argued that memory conflicts were normal in stressful situations and that there was no physical evidence of violence or an accident. To him, João had simply decided to abandon his family and start a new life elsewhere. The explanation sounded absurd to anyone who knew João Batista. He was a man of rigid routines, deeply attached to his family and proud of his work. He would never have left his wife and 3 sons without a word. Besides, he had taken no money, no documents, no clothes. He had left with only what he was wearing and his work tools, but the police were determined to close the case. They had more urgent crimes to solve, cases with clearer evidence, situations that generated pressure from the press or influential people. The disappearance of a 52-year-old bricklayer did not fit into any of their priority categories. The family tried to hire a lawyer, but the costs were prohibitive. The family's income had plummeted with João's absence, and his wife had to find work as a day laborer in the homes of the South Zone. It was a grueling, low-paying job that required her to take 2 buses there and 2 back. But it was the only way to keep the family afloat. The sons also had to contribute. The eldest abandoned his evening technical course and began working full-time as an electrician's assistant. The middle son, age 16, found a job in a local auto shop. Only the youngest continued his studies, but even he helped out after school selling candy at the school gate. The family's life settled into a routine of survival and anticipatory grief. They didn't know if João was alive or dead, if he had left of his own free will, or if something terrible had happened to him. It was a permanent anguish, a void in their chests that no amount of work could fill. Meanwhile, back at the construction site, something strange began to happen. 3 weeks after João's disappearance, the construction company announced severe financial problems. There were issues with suppliers, payment delays, and difficulties honoring signed contracts. The project, which had been moving at a rapid pace, began to slow drastically. The workers noticed the change immediately. Materials that were supposed to arrive never did. Machines started breaking down and were not repaired. Wages began to be paid late. Many workers, sensing the project's days were numbered, started looking for work on other sites. In May of 1992, less than 2 months after João's disappearance, the company officially declared bankruptcy. The news reached the workers via a notice taped to the front gate. The company could no longer continue the project. All employees were dismissed and the site would be closed until a legal solution could be found. It was a mass exodus. In 2 days, the land that had been buzzing with activity transformed into a graveyard of abandoned machinery and unfinished structures. Cranes stood frozen in odd positions like steel dinosaurs rusting in the sun. Piles of construction materials were left exposed to the elements, covered by tarps that the wind soon tore to shreds. The concrete mixers, including the one where João had worked on the morning he disappeared, were scattered across the lot like monuments to a lost war. The main one, the largest of them all, was left in a more remote area of the Rio de Janeiro site, near a makeshift storage area where abandoned tools, hardened bags of cement, and pieces of twisted rebar had accumulated. No one bothered to clean the machines before abandoning them. The mixer João knew so well was left with remnants of concrete in its drum, a gray sludge hardening with each passing day under the fierce Rio de Janeiro sun. In a few weeks, what was once liquid had turned to stone, forever sealing whatever had happened on that April morning. The site was fenced off with wooden boards and placed under the responsibility of a security company that sent a guard to pass by once a day, merely to check for intruders. But it was a minimal bureaucratic surveillance, with no real intention of protecting what had been left behind. Over time, nature began to reclaim the abandoned space. Tall grass grew between the rusted machines, vines wrapped themselves around the motionless cranes, and small trees sprouted amidst the rubble. It was as if nature itself was trying to erase the traces of the failed project, covering the secrets guarded by the gray concrete with a blanket of green. João's family watched all of this with a mixture of sorrow and outrage. They would sometimes pass by the abandoned lot, hoping to find some clue the police had missed, but the wooden fence blocked their view and the guards always chased them away when they tried to get closer. It was as if the construction site had become a sealed tomb, forever guarding the mysteries of that April morning when João Batista de Souza walked through its gates and never came out. The first few years after João's disappearance were the hardest for the family. The absence of the main provider left deep scars, not only on their finances but on the emotional fabric of their lives. The wife developed chronic insomnia that kept her awake late into the night, staring out the window hoping to see João walking down the dark street. The eldest son, who had given up his studies to work, carried a responsibility on his shoulders that should not have been his. At 19, he had become the man of the house, making decisions about bills, home repairs, and his younger brother's problems. The weight of this premature responsibility left visible marks on his face, which seemed to have aged years in just a few months. The middle son developed a silent rage against the world. At the auto shop where he worked, he was known for his efficiency, but also for the aggression with which he attacked the most difficult problems. He would wrench parts with more force than necessary, as if fighting against something invisible that had stolen his father. His colleagues learned not to talk about their families in his presence. The youngest, who was only 12 when João disappeared, suffered the most from the absence. He was the son who most resembled his father, not just physically, but in his quiet way of observing the world. He began to have frequent nightmares, dreaming he saw João trapped in dark places calling for help that never came. João's wife tried to keep hope alive during those first years. Every time the doorbell rang, her heart would leap, thinking it might be him returning. When she passed men on the street who had the same build as João, she would discreetly follow them for a few blocks until she was sure it was someone else. She also developed an obsessive habit of reading the police sections of local newspapers, searching for news of bodies found, workplace accidents, or unidentified men admitted to hospitals. It was a painful and fruitless search, but one she could not abandon. It was as if stopping her search would mean giving up on João forever. The neighbors, who had initially been supportive and offered help, gradually began to distance themselves. Not out of malice, but because the family's tragedy was a constant reminder of how drastically life could change in an instant. It was easier to pretend it hadn't happened, that João had simply moved to another neighborhood. At the police station, the case remained officially closed. The investigator who had led the initial inquiry was transferred to another unit, and no one else took an interest in reopening the file. The folders containing the workers' statements were stored in a forgotten archive, along with hundreds of other cases deemed to have no prospect of a solution. Meanwhile, the land where the abandoned construction site stood began to transform into a kind of urban no-man's land. The wooden fences were gradually torn down by homeless people who used the wood for fires. What remained was a barbed wire fence that did little to keep people out. The site became a meeting point for drug users, an illegal dumping ground for trash, and a shelter for people living on the streets. The vegetation grew unchecked, creating a small wild forest in the middle of the North Zone. The abandoned machines gradually disappeared. Some were stolen by scrap metal collectors, others sank into the overgrown thicket, but the concrete mixer where João had worked his last morning remained in the same place. It was too large to be moved easily, and the hardened concrete inside made it practically useless for any other purpose. It stood there half hidden by the foliage, an unwitting monument to an unsolved mystery. In 1995, 3 years after the disappearance, João's family made a painful but necessary decision: to make his absence official. Through a long and bureaucratic legal process, they had João declared legally dead, which allowed his wife to receive a small pension and settle matters like inheritance and insurance. It was a devastating moment. Signing the papers that declared João dead felt like a betrayal, even knowing it was just a legal formality. His wife cried through the entire court hearing, clutching the death certificate of a man she had never seen die, never buried, never laid to rest. But life had to go on. The sons grew up, found girlfriends, and began to build their own lives. The eldest married in 1997 and moved into a rented apartment near his mother's house. The middle son continued to work at the auto shop and bought a used motorcycle that was his greatest joy. The youngest finished his studies and found a job as an administrative assistant in a public office. João's wife never remarried. She had a few proposals over the years, good men who offered to help care for her and her family. But she always said she was still married, that João could come back at any moment, that she could not betray her husband's memory until she knew exactly what had happened to him. In 2000, 8 years after the disappearance, she made her last official attempt at an investigation. She approached a new detective who had taken over the police unit, brought all the documents again, and repeated the entire story one more time. The officer listened attentively and promised to look into the case, but nothing ever came of it. The file remained sealed and the mystery remained unsolved. It was as if João Batista de Souza had been erased from history, except in the memory of those who loved him and in the abandoned concrete mixer that held, unbeknownst to anyone, the best-kept secret in Rio's North Zone. The following decade brought significant changes to the area where the abandoned lot was located. The North Zone of Rio de Janeiro underwent a wave of urban renewal that transformed several industrial areas into commercial and residential centers. Old factories gave way to shopping malls. Abandoned warehouses were demolished to build housing complexes, and idle lands began to attract the interest of real estate developers. The lot where the old construction site stood did not go unnoticed in this movement. It was a large, well-located area with easy access to the city's main transport routes. Developers began to visit it occasionally, always accompanied by real estate agents and engineers who made notes on clipboards and took photos with digital cameras. The people who used the land as a shelter or meeting point noticed the different kind of activity. Imported cars began to park at the entrance. Men in suits walked through the tall grass making measurements. For sale signs appeared on nearby posts. It was clear that this forgotten piece of the city would not remain abandoned forever. João's family also noticed the activity. Whenever they passed through the area, which they still did occasionally on a silent pilgrimage of longing, they saw the signs that something was about to change. His wife felt a mix of anguish and hope. Perhaps the redevelopment of the land would unearth some clue about what had happened to her husband. In 2004, 12 years after João's disappearance, a logistics company called Transcarga Distribuidora officially purchased the lot. The project was ambitious, to build a modern distribution center for stocking and organizing merchandise destined for supermarkets throughout the Rio de Janeiro metropolitan area. The new company had solid financial backing and a well-defined schedule. Unlike the construction firm that had gone bankrupt in the 90s, Transcarga was a multinational with experience in similar projects across Brazil. They had modern machinery, specialized teams, and all the necessary permits to begin work immediately. The first phase of the project was a complete clearing of the site. All the vegetation that had grown wild during the years of neglect had to be removed. The rusted machines had to be hauled away and the remains of the old structures demolished. It was, in essence, a fresh start, as if the 12-year history of the place could be erased by bulldozers and excavators. The company hired for the cleanup specialized in reclaiming abandoned industrial areas. Its workers were accustomed to finding all sorts of things on sites like this: dead animals, toxic waste, unstable structures, and dangerous equipment. They always worked in full protective gear and followed strict safety protocols. The work began in September of 2004. A crew of 15 men arrived on site with backhoes, dump trucks, and cutting tools to dismantle the skeletal metal structures still standing. The noise of the machinery echoed through the neighborhood, waking memories many preferred to leave sleeping. For the first few weeks, the work proceeded as normal. The vegetation was cleared, revealing landscapes that had been hidden for more than a decade. Rusted cranes emerged from the undergrowth like the skeletons of prehistoric animals. Piles of construction materials appeared coated in a thick crust of grime and rust. The workers also found personal items left behind by the original crew. cracked hard hats, leather boots dried and stiffened by time, and small tools not valuable enough to have been stolen. Everything was tossed unceremoniously into the dump trucks, mere relics of an era no one wished to remember. It was during the third week of work that the team reached the most remote area of the lot, where the largest equipment had been stored. This was a section that had remained less visible over the years, shielded by a circle of overgrown trees and a canopy of vines that formed a natural green roof. There they found the abandoned concrete mixers. 5 machines of varying sizes, all covered in a thick layer of rust and accumulated filth. Vegetation had grown up around them, as if nature were trying to reclaim these metal objects and absorb them into the wild landscape. The largest of the mixers, the one where João Batista had worked on his last known morning, was positioned strangely. Unlike the others, which were scattered randomly, this one seemed to have been placed deliberately in a hidden corner, partially sheltered by a concrete structure that served as a makeshift roof. When the cleanup crew approached to examine the machine, the first thing that caught their attention was the state of its drum. While the other mixers were empty or contained only minimal residue, this one still held a significant amount of completely hardened concrete. It was like a solid, uniform stone that filled the entire interior, sealing it completely. The supervisor, an experienced man named Carlos Eduardo, found the situation odd. In over 20 years of working on abandoned sites, he had never seen a mixer left with concrete inside. It violated the most basic maintenance protocol. The material hardens quickly and can ruin a machine if not removed in time. But Carlos had a deadline to meet and couldn't waste time on curiosities. He instructed his team to try and remove the hardened block using pneumatic hammers and other demolition tools. The entire mixer would then be taken to a scrapyard, where it would be dismantled and sold for parts. What they didn't know was that they were about to open a time capsule, one that held the answer to a 12-year-old mystery, and that this answer would forever change the lives of a family that had never stopped searching for the truth. The morning of September 15, 2004, dawned overcast and humid in the north of Rio de Janeiro. As he did every morning, Carlos Eduardo arrived at the site before the other workers to check on the progress and plan the day's activities. The cleanup was moving along well, right on schedule, but there was still much to be done. That morning, the priority was to deal with the concrete-filled mixer. Carlos had brought in heavier equipment, an industrial drill with a diamond bit, high-powered pneumatic hammers, and specialized cutting tools for reinforced concrete. If they couldn't break up the petrified material, they would have to call in a specialized demolition company. The team gathered around the mixer at 8 o'clock. They were 6 experienced men, all wearing full personal protective equipment: helmets, safety glasses, reinforced gloves, and ear protection. The noise they were about to make would be deafening, and the concrete dust could be hazardous if inhaled. The first to try was Marcos, a worker who had been with Carlos for 5 years. He started with a medium-sized pneumatic hammer, attacking the surface of the hardened concrete with steady, rhythmic blows. The metallic din echoed across the site, mingling with the sounds of other machines working in different areas. After half an hour of intense labor, Marcos managed to open a small hole in the upper crust of the concrete. It was just a start. The hardened mass was at least half a meter deep, and removing it all would take hours. But it was progress, and Carlos was optimistic they could solve the problem that day. Next, it was José Roberto's turn to take the pneumatic hammer. He was a strong man, accustomed to heavy labor, and he attacked the concrete with an almost aggressive determination. With each blow, small chunks of the hardened mass flew into the air, revealing deeper layers of the material that had slept there for 14 years. Around 10 in the morning, José Roberto had managed to open a significant cavity in the upper part of the concrete. The hole was about 30 centimeters in diameter and nearly as deep. But as he leaned over the mixer to assess his progress, something strange caught his eye. At the bottom of the cavity he had created, partially hidden by concrete dust and loose fragments, was something that clearly did not belong in that uniform mass. It was an object of a different color, with a texture that didn't look like stone or cement. José Roberto shut off the pneumatic hammer and called for Carlos Eduardo. The two men leaned over the mixer, trying to get a better look at what was inside. Carlos took a small flashlight from his tool belt and aimed the beam into the hole. What they saw left them momentarily paralyzed. It was a piece of faded blue fabric, stained with cement, but clearly cloth. And next to it, partially visible among the concrete fragments, was something that looked like leather, perhaps part of a boot or a shoe. Carlos felt his stomach turn. In 20 years of experience, he had found many strange things on abandoned lots, but this was different. He ordered José Roberto to stop work immediately. He gathered the entire crew and explained the situation. They had found something suspicious inside the mixer, something that could be evidence of a crime. They needed to call the police before continuing any further. The call was made at 10:30 in the morning. Carlos spoke to the emergency dispatcher, explaining the situation with the calm of a man who knew he was dealing with something serious. Within 15 minutes, 2 patrol cars arrived, carrying 4 military police officers and a civil police inspector. The inspector, a middle-aged man named Ferreira, took immediate control. He ordered the entire area around the mixer to be cordoned off with yellow and black tape to keep onlookers away. He asked Carlos and his team to step back but remain available for questioning. Inspector Ferreira carefully examined the inside of the cavity. With a more powerful flashlight than Carlos's, he could see the objects mixed in with the hardened mass more clearly. In addition to the blue fabric and the piece of leather, there was something that looked like rusted metal, perhaps tools or personal belongings. More than 15 years of experience as a criminal investigator made him immediately suspicious. Bodies encased in concrete were not a novelty in Brazilian forensics. It was a relatively common way to hide evidence of murder. But finding one on a site that had been abandoned for so long was unusual. Ferreira called the forensics department and requested a team of experts be sent to the scene as quickly as possible. He also contacted the Medical Legal Institute, asking them to send a coroner prepared to handle old human remains. They had to follow every scientific protocol to ensure the evidence was properly preserved. While they waited for the experts, Ferreira began his initial questioning of Carlos Eduardo and his crew. He wanted to know how long they had been working on the site, if they had found any other suspicious objects, and if anyone had touched the mixer before that day. He also asked for information about the company that owned the land and the history of the location. Carlos told him what he knew, that the lot had been abandoned for many years, the site of a construction project that was never finished. That vegetation had taken over everything. He explained that his company had been hired only for the cleanup, and that this was the first time anyone had touched that particular mixer since it had been abandoned. This was a crucial piece of information. If no one had touched the machine for over a decade, and if there really was a body inside, then the death had occurred a very long time ago, possibly when the construction site was still active. At 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the forensic experts and the coroner arrived. It was a team of 5 specialists equipped with tools for forensic archaeology, professional cameras, and kits for collecting biological material. They knew this would be a delicate job, one that could take days to complete properly. What they didn't know yet was that they were about to solve a mystery that had left a family in agony for 14 long years. The scientific excavation of the remains inside the concrete mixer began that same afternoon. The team of experts established a rigorous protocol. Every fragment of concrete removed would be catalogued, photographed, and analyzed. Any object found would be isolated and preserved for later examination. It was meticulous work that could not be rushed. Dr. Henrique Cavalcante, the coroner in charge, had experience with similar cases. He had participated in excavations of clandestine cemeteries and the exhumation of bodies from illegal construction sites. But there was something particularly challenging about this case. The concrete had hardened to the consistency of natural rock. The first significant discovery came at around 4 in the afternoon. While carefully removing a layer of concrete from the center of the drum, a criminalist named Dr. Zandra Menezes found what was clearly a fragment of human bone. It was part of a rib, darkened by time and moisture but unmistakably human. The confirmation that there was indeed a body inside the mixer completely changed the pace of the investigation. Inspector Ferreira immediately alerted the Homicide Division, requesting that they send investigators specializing in cold cases. He also ordered the cordoned-off area to be expanded and for security guards to be posted to keep the curious away. The excavation work continued until nightfall but was halted when the natural light faded. Dr. Cavalcante preferred not to use artificial lighting in this initial phase, as it could compromise the precision of their work. The mixer was covered with a plastic tarp and left under police guard overnight. The next morning, an even larger team gathered at the site. In addition to the original experts, there were 2 detectives from the Homicide Division, a forensic anthropologist specializing in the identification of old bones, and a crime scene photographer to document every step of the exhumation process. The second day's work was more productive. With proper sunlight and more precise tools, the team managed to remove large sections of the hardened concrete without damaging the bones embedded within. Slowly, a human skeleton began to emerge from the iron drum. It was in a fetal position, as if the person had been placed inside while still alive. Dr. Cavalcante noted that the bones were in a relatively good state of preservation, protected by the concrete that had acted as a kind of sarcophagus. There were no obvious signs of physical violence, no clear fractures, no stab wounds or bullet holes. Death could have been caused by suffocation, poisoning, or some medical condition that leaves no marks on the skeleton. Along with the bones, personal effects began to appear that would help identify the victim. The first was a piece of leather that turned out to be part of a work boot, the type worn by construction workers. The leather was desiccated and deformed, but it was still possible to see that it was a large shade men's shoe. The second object was more revealing, fragments of a blue fabric that had clearly once been a cap. Though faded and crumbling, it was clearly the kind of sun hat commonly worn by laborers exposed to the elements. There were even remnants of a brand label, though the name had become illegible after so much time. But it was the third discovery that provided the most important clue to the man's identity. Late on the second day of the excavation, Dr. Sandra Menezes found a nearly intact metal tool. It was a small sledgehammer with a wooden handle which had been surprisingly well preserved within the concrete. On the metal head of the tool, a brand heated into the steel was still visible. JB89. The initials and the year etched into the hammer were crucial pieces of evidence. They suggested the tool had belonged to someone with the initials JB, and that it had been marked or purchased in 1989. Detective Ferreira immediately ordered his investigators to cross-reference all missing persons cases filed in the region between 1989 and 1992, focusing on men with those initials. Meanwhile, Dr. Cavalcanti continued the work of removing the bones. It was a delicate process. Some fragments were literally embedded in the concrete and had to be extracted with surgical precision. Each bone was cleaned, catalogued, and photographed before being placed in appropriate containers for transport to the medical examiner's office. On the third day, with most of the skeleton now removed from the concrete mixer, The discovery was made that would definitively connect these remains to the family that had been waiting for answers for 14 years. At the bottom of the drum, mixed in with the last fragments of concrete, was an object that had withstood the passage of time better than anything else: a leather wallet. The wallet was fused to the concrete as if it were part of it, yet it still retained its basic shape and, more importantly, some of its contents. When Dr. Menezes managed to carefully pry it open with surgical instruments, she found scraps of paper. Though damaged by moisture and time, they still showed legible portions of personal information. A name was partially preserved on a piece of a work card: João Batista de... The rest had disintegrated, but it was enough to confirm the suspicions that had been forming since the discovery of the hammer. Detective Ferreira was certain they had found João Batista de Souza, the bricklayer who had vanished in April of 1992. But the most important question remained. How did he end up inside that concrete mixer? Was it a terrible accident, or something far more sinister? The answer would forever change the lives of a family that had never stopped believing that one day the truth would come to light. Confirmation of João Batista de Souza's identity reached his family on a rainy September afternoon, 14 years and 5 months after he disappeared. Detective Ferreira made a point of delivering the news himself, accompanied by a psychologist from the civil police who specialized in supporting victims' families. He knew it would be a devastating moment even for people who had spent so long waiting. João's wife was home alone when the officers rang the doorbell. Her children were all at work, and she spent her afternoons sewing for clients, trying to supplement the small pension she received. When she opened the door and saw the uniforms, her heart began to race. She knew this day would come, but she was not ready for it. The conversation was long and painful. Detective Ferreira explained how they had found the remains, showed her photos of the hammer with the engraved initials, and described the fragments of documents that confirmed the identity. João's wife listened in silence, clutching a tissue the psychologist had offered her, without shedding a single tear. When the detective finished speaking, she asked only one question: how did he die? It was the question Ferreira had both expected and feared. The preliminary investigation had found no clear signs of physical violence. But that didn't mean the death was natural. Someone had hidden João's body inside the concrete mixer. That much was indisputable. The criminal investigation that followed was more complex than any Ferreira had conducted in his 15-year career. The main challenge was reconstructing events that had happened 14 years earlier. With few available witnesses and physical evidence that time had either degraded or destroyed completely. The first line of investigation focused on the records of the construction company, which had gone bankrupt shortly after João's disappearance. The company's documents were stored in the courthouse archives, buried among years of protracted bankruptcy proceedings. Ferreira and his team spent days poring over payroll sheets, workplace accident reports, and internal correspondence. What they found was disturbing. The construction company had officially recorded that João Batista failed to show up for work on April 3, 1992, the same story they had given the family at the time. But internal documents contradicted this information. There were material requisitions signed by João that very morning, and production reports that mentioned his work in the area of the concrete mixers. Even more suspicious was the fact that in the days following João's disappearance, there was an abnormal movement of equipment on the construction site. Fuel logs showed that several machines, including the concrete mixers, were operated outside of normal hours. There were also urgent requests for cement and other materials, as if someone were carrying out an unscheduled job. The second line of investigation attempted to locate the workers who had been on the site that day. 14 years later, many had moved away. Some had died, others had simply vanished. But Ferreira managed to find 7 men who still lived in the region and agreed to give new statements about what they remembered. Their accounts were consistent on one point. They all remembered seeing João working normally that morning, but there were discrepancies about the time. Some said they saw him at 9 o'clock, others at 10. Some claimed he was gone before lunch. It was as if the collective memory of what had happened had been purposely muddled. One testimony was particularly revealing. Sebastián Miranda, the former site foreman who had denied João's presence at the time, now admitted that he had lied. He said he received orders from his superiors to deny that João had been at the site, and that the entire crew was instructed to stick to the same story. But he wouldn't say who had given those orders or why. Sebastião also revealed something he had never told the family. On the afternoon of April 3rd, after they realized João was missing, a closed-door meeting took place between the site supervisors and representatives from the construction company. He didn't participate in the conversation, but he saw several people leave the makeshift office and head toward the concrete mixers. They were messing around over there for about 2 hours, Sebastián said in his deposition. They started up machines, moved equipment, made a hell of a noise. Then they sent everyone home early and told us that the next day no one was to say a word about João. It was the first concrete evidence of a cover-up. Someone had tried to hide what happened to João, and they had done so in an organized, premeditated way. But it remained to be seen whether they were hiding an accident or a crime. The third line of investigation involved the forensic analysis of João's bones. Dr. Cavalcanti and his team spent weeks examining each fragment, searching for signs of trauma, evidence of poisoning, or any clue as to the cause of death. The bones were subjected to X-rays, chemical tests, and microscopic analysis. The results were inconclusive. There were no fractures to indicate physical violence, no chemical residues to suggest poisoning, no marks from bullets or bladed weapons. The only possible conclusion was that João had died from causes that leave no trace on the skeleton. Suffocation, cardiac arrest, a sudden medical condition. But Dr. Cavalcanti made a crucial observation. The position in which the bones were found inside the mixer suggested that João had been placed there either while still alive or immediately after death. The body was in a fetal position, as if he had tried to protect himself, or as if someone had folded him that way to save space inside the drum. It was a disturbing discovery. If João had been placed in the mixer alive, his death had been caused by the concrete poured over him. If he was already dead, someone had used the machine as a makeshift sarcophagus to hide the body. In either case, other people were involved. The investigation was closing in on a terrible conclusion. João Batista de Souza had not simply disappeared. He had been murdered, and his body had been concealed in the most cowardly way imaginable, sealed in concrete as if it were industrial waste. But finding out who had done it would be even harder than finding the body. The advancing investigation uncovered a network of corruption and negligence that extended far beyond the disappearance of João Batista. Detective Ferreira discovered that the construction company had been embroiled in several scandals involving overbilling and the use of substandard materials in public projects. The company's sudden bankruptcy, so soon after João vanished, began to make sense in this broader context. Documents obtained from the public prosecutor's office revealed that João had become a problem for the company in the weeks leading up to his disappearance. As an experienced bricklayer, he had noticed irregularities in the quality of the concrete being used. The mix had too much water, the cement was from a dubious source, and the ratios were incorrect, compromising the structural integrity of the buildings. According to new testimony from former colleagues who only now felt safe enough to speak the truth, João had begun to openly question the work methods on site. He had even threatened to report the irregularities to regulatory agencies, saying he didn't want to be responsible for a tragedy when the warehouse collapsed in the future. It was typical of João, an honest, hard-working man who took his profession seriously and refused to do shoddy work. But on a site run by unscrupulous people, his professional integrity had become a threat that needed to be eliminated. The reconstruction of the events of April 3, 1992 began to crystallize through the new testimonies. João had arrived at work as usual, but during the morning he got into a serious argument with the site supervisor over the quality of the concrete being produced. The argument took place near the mixers in front of other workers. According to witnesses, João had refused to use a batch of concrete he considered inadequate for the structures being poured. He called it a hack job and said it could cause serious accidents down the line. The supervisor reacted badly. He yelled at João, telling him he was just a bricklayer and had no authority to question technical decisions. The argument escalated when João threatened to stop working and go find the project engineers. It was then that the supervisor called over other men, including representatives from the construction company who were visiting the site that day. João was taken aside for a private conversation in a more secluded area of the site, near the mixers at the back of the property. No one knows exactly what happened during that conversation. Witnesses working nearby heard raised voices, a heated argument, but couldn't make out the words. What they do know is that after a few minutes the argument stopped abruptly, and João was never seen again. One of the theories Detective Ferreira investigated was that João had been killed during that confrontation. Perhaps he was pushed or assaulted or suffered a sudden medical event, brought on by the stress of the situation. What seemed certain was that his death had been accidental, but the cover-up was premeditated and calculated. With João dead on the ground, those in charge of the site found themselves with an enormous problem. They couldn't call the police because that would expose all the construction irregularities. They couldn't explain the death because that would make them criminally responsible. The only solution they saw was to make the body disappear completely. The concrete mixer where João had been working became the perfect instrument for their crime. It was a large machine with a drum capable of holding a man's body, and it was going to be filled with concrete anyway. Placing João inside and pouring the mixture over him would create a hermetic tomb that might never be discovered. The plan required the participation of several people. Someone had to move João's body into the mixer. Others had to prepare an extra batch of concrete outside the normal work plan. The machine had to be operated at an unusual time, after most of the workers had gone home. The fuel and material logs that Ferreira found in the company archives confirmed this version of events. On the late afternoon of April 3rd, there was an unscheduled consumption of diesel fuel to operate machinery, an extraordinary requisition of cement and sand, and the use of equipment far off the established schedule. More disturbing still, in the days that followed, the mixer where João had been entombed was deliberately moved to a more remote area of the site and covered with a makeshift structure. It was as if those responsible wanted to ensure it would be forgotten when the project was abandoned. And that is exactly what happened. When the construction company went bankrupt a few months later, its failure possibly hastened by the need to quickly close the books on that compromised project, the mixer containing João's body was lost among the abandoned equipment. For 14 years, it served as an unwitting monument to a perfect crime. Detective Ferreira's investigation identified at least 6 people who were directly involved in the cover-up of João Batista's death. But 14 years later, 3 of them had died of natural causes. 2 had moved to other states and were never located, and only 1 still lived in the Rio de Janeiro area. It was Sebastião Miranda, the former construction foreman now working as a doorman in a residential building in Barra da Tijuca. When he was called in for a new deposition, this time as a suspect and no longer a witness, Sebastian finally told the whole truth about what had happened on that April afternoon in 1992. According to him, João had not been intentionally murdered. During an argument with the supervisor and representatives from the construction company, a shove occurred. João struck his head on an iron structure and died instantly. It was an accident, but one set against a backdrop of such grave irregularities that no one wanted to take responsibility. "We panicked," Sebastian said in his deposition. "We knew that if we called the police, we would all go to jail. The whole project was a mess. The materials were of terrible quality. People were taking bribes. João's death became the least of our worries." It was then that someone, Sebastian wouldn't say who, suggested hiding the body inside the cement mixer. It would be quick, efficient, and no one would ever find out. They just had to fill the machine with concrete and let it harden. When the project was finished, the mixer would be sold for scrap and the secret would be buried forever. The plan almost worked. If the construction company hadn't gone bankrupt, if the land hadn't been abandoned for so many years. If a new company hadn't decided to completely clear the area, João Batista de Souza would have remained a missing person forever. His family would have been left without answers, and those responsible for his death would have remained unpunished. But the very concrete used to hide the crime had preserved the evidence that would uncover the truth 14 years later. Sebastião Miranda's deposition paved the way for the final developments in the case. Based on his revelations, Detective Ferreira was able to identify others who were still alive and had participated in the cover-up. 2 of them agreed to cooperate with the authorities in exchange for reduced sentences, confirming the version of events presented by the former foreman. The public prosecutor's office filed criminal charges against 4 individuals for concealment of a corpse, fraud, and criminal conspiracy. As he had voluntarily cooperated with the investigation, Sebastián Miranda received the benefit of a plea bargain and was sentenced only to community service. The other 3 defendants received prison sentences ranging from 2 to 5 years. For João Batista's family, the end of the mystery brought a mixture of relief and outrage. After 14 years of imagining the worst possibilities, kidnapping, torture, prolonged suffering, discovering that his death had been quick and accidental was a small consolation. But knowing that unscrupulous people had hidden his body as if it were trash, preventing him from having a dignified burial, caused a pain that would never fully heal. João's wife, now 67, said she could finally sleep in peace. For all those years, the worst moments were in the dead of night when she would lie awake wondering if her husband was suffering somewhere, if he was being held prisoner, if he was trying to come home. To know that he had passed quickly without prolonged suffering was the only peace she could find in the tragedy. The 3 sons reacted to the truth in different ways. The eldest, who had become the family's provider at the age of 19, felt a deep rage toward the people who had stolen his chance to say a proper goodbye to his father. The middle son, who had developed issues with aggression, paradoxically became calmer after learning the truth. It was as if the uncertainty had been worse than the reality, however painful. The youngest, who was 26 when his father's body was found, said the discovery helped him better understand his own personality. Throughout his adolescence and early adulthood, he had felt abandoned, rejected, as if he weren't important enough for his father to stay. Knowing that João had not chosen to leave his family allowed him to make peace with his own history. The burial of João Batista de Souza took place in October 2006, 14.5 years after his death. It was a simple ceremony but heavy with emotion. Neighbors who had known João, colleagues from other construction sites, and distant relatives who hadn't seen the family in years. All came to pay their last respects to the man who had been swallowed by his own profession. The coffin was carried on the shoulders of his 3 sons and other local masons, a demonstration of solidarity from their trade. At the cemetery, João's wife placed the faded blue cap that had been found with his bones on top of the coffin. It was the same cap he wore every day, the one that had become a symbol of his identity as a worker. The simple headstone bore only the basic information: name, dates of birth and death, and a phrase chosen by the family: an honest worker who did not deserve this end. It was an epitaph that summarized both João's life and his death. A man of integrity who paid with his life for having principles in an environment where corruption was the rule. The land where João had worked and died was finally transformed into the distribution center that the new company had planned. Aware of the site's history, the company made a point of installing a small commemorative plaque at the building's entrance in memory of João Batista de Souza, 1940-1992, a worker who gave his life for professional dignity. The cement mixer where João had been found was donated by the police to the family, who decided to turn it into a monument. It was installed in the main square of their neighborhood, painted blue, the color of the cap João always wore, and surrounded by a small garden maintained by local residents. It became a meeting point for construction workers, who would sometimes leave flowers or symbolic tools by the monument. It was a way to honor not only João Batista but all the workers who died in suspicious circumstances and never had their stories told. The repercussions of João Batista's case led to changes in labor legislation related to the construction industry. Stricter regulations for site inspections were created, along with more severe penalties for companies using inadequate materials, and mandatory protocols for investigating the disappearance of workers from construction sites. But for the family, none of this brought João back. What remained was the memory of a good man who had fought his whole life to build a better future for his children, and who died defending the principles he held more important than life itself. João Batista de Souza had finally come home. 10 years after the discovery of his body, João Batista de Souza's story continued to echo through the north side of Rio de Janeiro. A silent reminder of the dangers faced by honest workers in a country where corruption often prevails over justice. The monument in the square had become more than a simple tribute. It was a symbol of resistance for a profession whose voices are rarely heard. João's wife, now retired, dedicated part of her time to visiting the families of other workers who had disappeared or died in suspicious circumstances. Her 14-year search for answers had transformed her into an informal counselor for people going through the same anguish she had endured. She knew how to navigate police bureaucracy, the legal channels to push for investigations, and she understood the importance of never giving up the search for truth. João's 3 sons built their lives always carrying their father's memory as a source of inspiration. The eldest became a civil engineer and made it a point to work only with companies that strictly followed safety and quality standards. The middle son founded a small construction company known in the region for its honesty and dignified treatment of employees. The youngest graduated with a law degree and specialized in labor cases, defending workers who were victims of accidents or irregularities. The company that had accidentally discovered João's body maintained the commemorative plaque at the entrance of its distribution center and created a scholarship program for the children of construction workers. It was a way to honor João's memory while helping other families avoid the financial hardships his family had faced. In 2016, 24 years after João's death, An investigative journalist decided to delve deeper into the story and discovered that the case was not unique. Through research in public archives and interviews with former construction workers, he identified at least 12 other cases of workers who had disappeared under similar circumstances between 1990 and 2000 in the greater Rio de Janeiro area. The series of reports he published had a national impact and led to the creation of a parliamentary inquiry to investigate deaths and disappearances in the construction industry. The name João Batista de Souza was cited several times during the commission's work as an example of how negligence and corruption can turn workplace accidents into crimes against humanity. Sebastián Miranda, the former foreman who had cooperated with the authorities, became a kind of activist for workers' rights. After completing his alternative sentence, he began visiting construction sites to educate workers about their rights, how to report irregularities, and the importance of never accepting inadequate working conditions out of fear of losing their jobs. The cement mixer turned monument in João's neighborhood continued to be maintained by the local community. Every year on April 3rd, the anniversary of his death, residents would gather there for a small ceremony in his memory. Construction workers from all over the North Zone would come to pay their respects, leave flowers, or simply reflect on the risks of their profession. The story of João Batista de Souza had become larger than the man himself. It was no longer just about a mason who disappeared and was found 14 years later inside a cement mixer. It was about professional dignity, about the right of every worker to return home safely at the end of the day, about the importance of never accepting that human lives are disposable. In 2022, 30 years after his death, the Rio de Janeiro City Council passed a law establishing João Batista de Souza Day. April 3rd would officially be the day for construction worker safety. The law required all construction companies in the city to hold talks on workplace safety on that date, and established more severe penalties for companies that violated worker protection standards. The family received the honor with emotion, but also with the awareness that what mattered most were not the monuments or the laws created in João's memory. What mattered most was that his death had not been in vain, that his story had helped protect other workers, and that his professional integrity had become an example to be followed. João Batista de Souza had left home on an April morning in 1992 as an ordinary mason, concerned only with doing his job to the best of his ability. 30 years later, his name was engraved in the history of the struggle for labor rights in Brazil. It was an immortality he had never sought, but one that his honesty had earned. The concrete that was meant to erase his story forever ended up preserving his memory for generations to come. If this story has touched you in any way, please consider subscribing to the channel, sharing this video with people who need to hear real cases like this, and suggesting in the comments other stories that deserve to be investigated. Together we can ensure that the memory of people like João Batista de Souza is never forgotten.